You know, folks, I spent a long time yesterday discussing the bigger picture from the IRS and the rest of these scandals. That these scandals are going on all the time. I explained this is the nature of an all-powerful, centralized, authoritarian government, and it's only going to get worse. And I explained that the statist, the left, has a totalitarian mindset, and it seeks to devour the individual and the civil society. You've heard me say this before, but I talked about how this is just further evidence of it. Apparently today a number of other people have been talking about it, and that's the power of this program. This program is about substance. It's about thought. It's about knowledge and history and philosophy and trying to make sense out of what's going on, not just doing the headlines. But we need to take it a little bit further today. Oh, yes, I'll get more into it, but the big issue. Our nation has entered an age of post-constitutional soft tyranny. And Alexis de Tocqueville, a prescient thinker and scholar and philosopher who came to America twice and wrote Democracy in America, which is actually 2 volumes. He pointed out that this soft tyranny, it covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate, to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but softened and bent and guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It doesn't tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. Does this not explain what the IRS has done and has become? Social engineering, and this is me, and central planning are imposed without end, since the governing masterminds, drunk with their own conceit and pomposity, have wild imaginations and infinite ideas for reshaping society and molding man's nature in search of the ever-elusive utopian paradise. Their clumsy experiments and infantile pursuits are not measured against any rational standard. Their piousness and sanctimony are justification enough. Today, Congress operates not as the framers intended, but in the shadows, where it dreams up its most notorious and oppressive laws, only coming into the light to trumpet the genius and earnestness of its goings-on, and to enable members to cast their votes. The people are left lame-brained and dumbfounded about their so-called representatives' supposed good deeds, which usually take the form of omnibus bills numbering in hundreds, if not thousands of pages, and utterly clueless about the effects these laws have on their lives. But that's the point. The public is not to be informed, but indoctrinated, manipulated, and misled. Congress also, and often, delegates unconstitutionally lawmaking power to a gigantic yet ever-growing administrative state, which in turn unleashes on society myriad regulations and rules at such a rapid rate that people cannot possibly know of them either. And if by chance they do, they cannot possibly comprehend them. Nonetheless, ignorance, which is widespread and deliberately so, is no excuse for noncompliance, for which the citizen is heavily fined and severely punished. Not to be outdone, the current occupant of the Oval Office sees his primary duty as fundamentally transforming the United States of America. And by this, of course, Barack Obama did not mean a fresh allegiance to the nation's founding principles and a new respect for the Constitution's limits on federal authority, but the converse. He's more blatant and aggressive than his 20th century predecessors, but faithfully follows the footsteps of the most transgressive among them. The metamorphosis of the executive branch into an immense institution exercising a conglomeration of powers, including lawmaking and decreeing, is clearly without constitutional origin. Today, this is glorified and glamorized as compassionate progressivism. The framers called it despotism. Federalist 48, James Madison, considered the father of the Constitution. He wrote that, quote, an elective despotism was not the government we fought for, but one which should not only be founded on free principles, but in which the powers of government should be so divided and balanced among several bodies of magistracy as that no one could transcend their legal limits without effectually checked and restrained by the others. The illimitable regulatory activity with which the federal government torments, harasses, and coerces us, and coerces the individual's private and economic behavior, is the progeny of a colossal federal edifice with inexhaustible energy for societal manipulation and change. In order to satisfy its gluttonous appetite for programmatic schemes, the federal government not only hurriedly digests the Treasury's annual revenue, funded with confiscatory taxes on a diminishing number of productive citizens, but deserts on the wealth yet created by generations yet born with unconstrained indebtedness. And what havoc has this wrought? The federal government consumes nearly 25% of all goods and services produced every year by the American people. Yearly deficits routinely exceed $1 trillion. The federal government has incurred a fiscal operating debt of over $17 trillion, far exceeding the total value of the annual economic wealth created by the American people, and is expected to reach around $26 trillion in a decade. The federal government has accumulated unfunded liabilities for entitlement programs exceeding $90 trillion, which is growing at 4.6 to 6.9 trillion a year. There's not enough money on the planet to make good on the federal government's financial obligations. So the Federal Reserve Board has swung into action with multiple versions of so-called quantitative easing, which is nothing more than the federal government monetizing its own debt or buying its own debt with a combination of borrowing, issuing itself credit, and printing money amounting to trillions of dollars. Of course, this has the eventual effect of devaluing the currency, fueling significant inflation, not today, but down the road, and destabilizing the economy at some future point. It's asking too much of today's governing masterminds and their fanatical adherents to reform the product of their own fatuity. That is, the continuing disassembling of the Constitution and society. After all, despite one credible source after another, both within and outside the federal government, ringing alarm bells about the nation's hazardous track, describing it as unsustainable, desperate, and immoral, they are blinded to reason, experience, and knowledge by their political DNA and their ideological invincibility, and therefore intransigent to effective ameliorative steps. They long ago renounced by word and action their adherence to the Constitution's confinements as the statists' utopia and the framers' Constitution cannot coexist. History demonstrates that republics collapse when demagogues present themselves as their guardians to entice the people and cloak their true intentions. Meanwhile, we the people, the American people, are extremely dissatisfied with the federal government. Nearly 3/4 of us view it unfavorably, only 28% favorably. Local and state governments are regarded more highly by large majorities, 63% and 57% respectively. This creates an extremely volatile and unhealthy atmosphere in what is supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. How much longer can such widespread and deep public discontent with the federal government persist? Is it not time to rescue what is ours? That is the question. Is it not time? I say the answer is yes. It's well beyond the time. Well, Mark, what should we do? I'm going to spend the latter part of the summer and the early part of the fall explaining what I think we need to do, whether we can or will do it or not. But ladies and gentlemen, let us not be fooled. The IRS scandal, the EPA scandal, the Agriculture Department scandal, this is not really example of scandal government. This is example of tyranny. This is an example of a government that's unmoored from the Constitution. This is a post-constitutional government. That's what it is. I'll be right back.
Mark Levin.